Before we get into this week's episode, I want to make a plug for Art Market Minute. This is ArtNet News' new micro-podcast hosted by Margaret Kerrigan, who's the site's news editor Europe. It offers a weekly snapshot of essential art market news, expertly compiled by the ArtNet Pro editorial team.
We choose to elevate the everyday because the everyday is where you find heroes.
Hi, I'm Andrew Goldstein, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News where the art world meets the real world, bringing each week's biggest story down to earth. Today, as America celebrates Juneteenth, the anniversary of the abolition of slavery, people of all backgrounds across the country are urgently conscious of how little time has in fact passed since emancipation and how early in the history of a free United States we really are. This long march toward true equality stretches out into the distance, but it's also vividly unfolding in the streets right now in the protests that have burst forth after the murder of George Floyd. One person who is monitoring this moment with particularly close attention is Aaron Bryant, a curator of photography, visual culture, and contemporary history at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. That's because he is busy acquiring the most resonant artifacts of this protest movement as it is happening in his role as the head of the museum's rapid response collecting team. To talk about how he approaches this heady responsibility, I'm pleased to have Aaron Bryant on the podcast today. So thank you very much for coming on The Art Angle, Aaron.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure.
I especially appreciate your being available right now, considering how incredibly busy you must be. Where are you actually zooming in from today?
Baltimore. I'm in Baltimore at the moment.
Okay. So you are the curator of photography at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. But these past few weeks, as protests have been erupting across the country in the wake of George Floyd's murder, you've been devoting much of your energy to leading the museum's rapid response collecting team. Can you tell me, what is rapid response collecting exactly, and what does your team do?
Well, yeah, a couple of things. I'm curator of photography as well as visual culture and contemporary history. And so when you think about protest movements and getting the message out, whether it's with protesters carrying signs and placards or posters and bills that have been posted on boards throughout the city, it's really about visual culture and how do you use a space to create some sort of visual dialogue to grab people's attention to your message. So all of this actually fits within the kind of work that I've been doing for maybe almost 2 decades at this point. I was a visual arts curator before coming to the Smithsonian, but I also spent about 15 years studying photography and the civil rights movement. And in that research, I also studied civil rights, visual culture. So that's how I ended up in this position. And in terms of rapid response is generally something that's happening right now, and we need to get out and respond to it. I did it before with, say, Freddie Gray protest in Baltimore. Mm-hmm. You hear about a rally or a protest march, some sort of demonstration, and you want to be there. You want to be a part of that history, but you also want to make sure you're in a position to help record and document that history, meet people and talk to them about their experiences, because my job really is, as a historian, my job is to make sure that those voices and those experiences don't get lost to history, that we can move voices from the fringes and the margins to the center of any kind of national dialogue. So rapid response is really about looking at contemporary history, but responding to it as it's happening. An example might be, in 2015, we actually did a day-long program of panels and artistic expression and presentations related to Black Lives Matter and looking at what does this moment mean to us now. And it was in response to what was happening with Ferguson and protests after Ferguson. And on the day that we did the program, the first uprisings happened in Baltimore related to Freddie Gray. And so we had audience members as well as panelists. They were coming to our museum, which was really taking a lead in the discussion on a national level at that point. They were shifting between Baltimore and our museum to be a part of the conversation. So I think that's the basic idea behind rapid response. How can we be as responsive as possible to our community's needs?
So if you think of a traditional curator as being something like an elective surgeon who does surgery that is, planned years in advance, months in advance, rapid response is a little bit more like the EMT that goes out there and deals with the situation on the ground in a very quickly moving kind of environment. And obviously that has been very much in demand in the past couple of weeks when things have been moving so quickly. So what have you been working on in this latest eruption of protests since Floyd?
Well, one of the things that we've just started doing recently is reaching out directly to people, different agencies as well as grassroots organizations and just individual demonstrators and activists to talk to them about their perspectives and experiences to get a better sense of what their stories would be. When you collect objects are just metaphors for individual humanities, and behind each object and each humanity is a story. And that's really what we're looking for. How can we share these voices and share their stories? So after identifying some things, then we might move forward with trying to bring things into the collection. But right now, it's really been about cultivating relationships and getting a sense of how do we represent these stories. Out of all the things that we can select, how do we use this time now to get a really good sense of the voices and stories that need to be preserved?
Well, somewhat fortuitously, some of the most resonant protests have been happening just a few blocks away from the museum itself at the White House. And I was reading an article recently about how you and your team were out there witnessing all the artworks that were posted on this extra security wall that the White House had erected. And that seems like a very clear place where you could go and you could see artworks that are already iconic because they're in the visual culture as part of news photography and social media photography. What kind of things do you look for in a situation like that kind of tips you off or rings some bell that an object or an image is of particular historic note?
I would say the message and how quickly the message hits, not just cognitively, but emotionally. I remember, for example, seeing a protest sign that said very simply, "I miss my dad." So for me, it's about humanity. And I remember years ago, one of my mentors said to me that you shouldn't be afraid to be as specific as possible because in that specificity is universality. And I'll never forget that, So out of all the messages that might have been on the fence or across the street on the board at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, it was that message, "I miss my dad," that I thought, no matter who you are in the world, you understand this message. So I look for that kind of poignancy and humanity because that humanity will outlive me or any of the folks protesting today. That humanity will last forever. And 100, 200 years from now, people will still understand that message.
I read somewhere that after the 2015 Freddie Gray protest, one artifact that you acquired for the museum was the rake that was used to clean up after the protests. And that's kind of notable, from an art nerd standpoint, because it's a little bit like Duchamp's snow shovel. It's like an object that, in context gets a lot of power, but also it's a very ordinary object. What is the range of the objects that you acquire?
Well, we actually will acquire anything. And I'll give a shout out to my colleague, Talani Salahuddin, who actually collected that rake, I believe from a church that had mobilized the community to do cleanup after the uprisings So I would say that that's the strength of our museum. We often think of history as being about gods and generals. Our museum actually privileges everyday voices because it's really ordinary people who have the courage to go out and take extraordinary measures to change the course of history. So something like a rake is no different than us presenting a tool that was used by a tenant farmer. We choose to elevate the everyday because the everyday is where you find heroes.
And to go back to Baltimore and the Freddie Grape protests again, I also read that after Councilwoman Sharon Green Middleton addressed a rally, you asked her for the anti-violence T-shirt that she was wearing to bring to the museum's collection.
Yes.
And she said yes. And then another display in the collection consists of the shoes and a suit that a pastor wore during the protests in Ferguson. And it's incredible that these people are giving you the clothing off their back. I mean, literally, they are giving you their clothing for the museum. And it makes me wonder, has anybody ever said no to having an object acquired by the museum?
Not to me, actually. I can't think of a moment when I asked for something and didn't get it. I think part of it is you really have to be sincere about wanting to preserve the thing you're asking for. For me, it's not about collecting trophies. When I ask for something, it's because I have a very, very compelling reason to want to collect it. When things come to the Smithsonian, they're considered national treasures. So I tend to be a little more discerning about what I ask for.
Wow.
And I think people get that. I think specifically with our museum, people support our work because they know the work is necessary. We all have a lot of work to do, whether you're a journalist or you're a lawyer or wherever you are in your life. We all can contribute in some way to change the narrative and change the course of history. I really believe that.
So to roll back the clock a little bit, the rapid response collecting at your museum seems to have originated with founding director Lonnie Bunch. And correct me if I'm wrong, but he has since gone on to become the first African-American to lead the Smithsonian as a whole in its 170-some-year history. And he was an early champion of the need to collect today for tomorrow. He believed that, as he put it, any moment when America is debating its identity, it's crucial to collect it. So how novel was this idea at the time when he was first kind of espousing it?
I will say that, quite honestly, I think that Lonnie's a genius. And I'm not just saying that because he's the secretary. The man is a genius. And to witness how he operates and thinks within this environment is absolutely astonishing. So pretty much anything he does, you might claim was pioneering and innovative. And I think that's the foundation on which our museum is built, to pioneer, to change the paradigm. I will say, though, that for decades, museums had been collecting that way. If you think about museums that collect around political events, whether they're political conventions or civil rights demonstrations, museums have collected events as they have happened. The difference might be that it had to be a certain kind of event. It had to be a presidential inauguration for us to collect on this. Lonnie was, I think, one of the first people to actually recognize how important it was to collect those objects that represent the everyday experiences of everyday Americans. And that's the innovation, I think.
I know that now this has become something that a number of museums are doing. Is there competition for particularly noteworthy objects?
Well, I would say among some museums. I don't think for us, though, because we're pretty solid in why we collect this material. We're absolutely connected to certain kinds of communities and life experiences. So we don't really pay attention to the competition because we're doing what we do and what I think we are uniquely qualified and successful at doing. That would be the first part of that answer. The second part of the answer is I think there's a collegiality among museums around the world, across the country, and even within the Smithsonian. In fact, with this particular project, we're working with Smithsonian museums across the campus. And we're now looking at how we can expand it to include other museums, curators who are working at other museums like American Art Portrait Gallery and the Latino Center, the Asian Pacific Island Center. We all want to come together to preserve this history and to make sure that we contribute in some way to making positive social change.
Speaking of working together, I think you mentioned before that you work with a network of activists in the vanguard of the protests to let you know of particular objects that you may be interested in. Is this a network that you've been cultivating for a long time, or is it more of an ad hoc thing?
In some cases, it's like we have relationships that we have been cultivating with people for a long time. And so in a moment like this, we can actually reach out to folks in our networks to ask if they might be participating in demonstrations or if they know of folks who might be interested in donating objects. And so we can call on those folks often because really it's sort of like a family. We're not at all transactional. And we believe that we're all part of one community and one family. And people understand that. So they are willing to help us as much as they can. And then in some cases, it's really a matter of you run across an image online, you read an article, you see a photograph, and you say, I have to reach out to this person, or you see the name of an association or an organization on a placard or some sort of board, and you feel compelled to reach out to them. And so, it's a little of both. Sometimes it's cold calling, but oftentimes the process begins with reaching out to people who are part of the family.
I mean, you mentioned the transactional component that brings up the crass question of, do you pay to acquire these things, or are they always, in the form of a donation?
Generally, they're in the form of a donation. It really depends. I like to ask people to donate because I think it's part of investing in the work we do. But at the same time, it's not always fair. If someone creates a sculpture and they had to invest $20,000 to create the sculpture, it's kind of unfair. But, I'll ask, would you mind donating this? Mm-hmm. But so it really depends. But across the board at the museum, sometimes we do purchase donations and that kind of thing, but not with politics usually. And community mobilization takes all of us to get involved.
Looking back on the George Floyd protests, it seems that the marquee artwork was the mural that was made by 3 artists on the Cup Foods supermarket right near the intersection where he was killed. And it has, Floyd's head inscribed within this sunflower that has the names of other victims of police violence, and it's surrounded by these protesters. And this has been reproduced in the newspaper all over the place, and was even digitally reproduced above the altar in George Floyd's memorial service. Mm-hmm. Is this the kind of object that your museum might consider acquiring, even though it's a mural, so it's physically kind of built into the environment?
Yeah, that's a more difficult one. My rapid response to that would be, I think that's such a community-oriented object that it rightfully belongs in that community. We collect nationally, absolutely, because we want to tell national stories, but we're also very respectful and sensitive and supportive of communities telling their own stories. We even have programs to help communities tell their stories, like our community curation platform, for example, where we actually go out and teach communities about preservation and conservation and how to determine whether or not something's historical. And if you have something historical, what do you do with it? We often recommend that they donate to their local museums and historical societies or libraries. Because, we see what we do as a movement. It's not just about the Smithsonian or the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It's about preserving American history and culture. To do that, it takes the entire nation.
The protests right now are not only creating new art and new visual culture, but they're also destroying old art. So right now, the toppling of Confederate monuments is probably the latest expression that this protest movement has really taken in the headlines. What are your feelings about that, and how would a toppled Confederate monument have a place within your museum?
I will say it's something we would consider, quite honestly, but there are also certain requirements for us to collect something. And, I think in these moments related to Confederate monuments, and if you've done your homework, you probably know I was chair of the Baltimore City's Special Commission on Confederate Monuments. I believe there are teachable moments in these things that will help us to become a better nation. But I think there's a way that we need to actually educate people on exactly why these monuments were erected and what they stood for and what they still stand for today. So we might not collect a Confederate monument, but I can see how a museum might be interested in a Confederate monument.
Now, is there such a thing as a rapid response curating team that is taking the objects that you're bringing in and then arranging them into exhibitions that can go up relatively soon?
Yeah, there's absolutely a rapid response team. Again, if we go back to how we're operating at the Smithsonian, on the macro level, we're working with other museums and units across the Smithsonian, more specifically, the Anacostia Community Museum and the National Museum of American History. And then each museum has a team of folks who are working together across the board. Right now, we have like 4 or 5 primary people who are part of the curatorial team. But then later, as we start bringing things in, we'll also bring in folks who are in collections management and project management and other folks who will help us to actually transport materials. It's moving so quickly, you need as many hands as possible. It's brain intensive and labor intensive.
So speaking of things moving quickly, were you just a few weeks ago collecting artifacts from the coronavirus and its horrendously unequal impact on the Black community in America?
Actually, we're doing both at the same time, so I'm kind of busy.
I mean, are you treating these as different things, or are they kind of the same thing?
Treating them as separate collecting projects, but sort of the same, because, you might argue that there is a relationship between the two. But in terms of how I think about this curatorially, treating them as 2 separate things, our strategy for collecting around COVID would be very different from our strategies for collecting on protests regarding George Floyd's death.
Now, when you mention this continuum, there is obviously a very long history of protest stemming from the civil rights movement to today. One of the most extraordinarily powerful pieces that you have in your collection is almost a relic, which is the coffin of 14-year-old Emmett Till, who's slain in Mississippi in 1955, set in motion the civil rights movement. Do you see these objects in the collection being different chapters in a story of tragedy and protest and this kind of long march?
I would say I think about what's happening in present day within a historical context. I mean, that's what we do as historians, to try to make history relevant to present day lives. So it's important that we be able to look at what's happening today within a trajectory of history and human progress. So in terms of George Floyd, I would look at his death in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement in general, but there are also connections to other things like Janet 6 and Rodney King. And then you can go back through the civil rights movement, not just Emmett Till, but I would say the Scottsboro Boys. I mean, these things that come to mind, the lynchings, and then how does that take us all the way back to the 19th century, and the turn of the century, and violence against African Americans as a way to sort of monitor and suppress action. And so I will say that, yeah, it can be argued that it is part of a much larger history.
And it's not a very old history, which is a shocking thing. How do you think these protests today, compare? Is there something new about this, or is it kind of conforming to a pattern that you would see over the course of time?
Well, I would say there is a pattern to a certain degree, but as a historian, the first thing that I would notice is what are the things that are changing? So when thinking about what people might consider historical, it's really those moments that we witness some sort of transformation or some sort of shift. And so I think this moment fits in with that. It's very different for a number of reasons. One, this is how Black Lives Matter has sort of been put on the historical map, not just because of its impact on our everyday lives, but you look at the role of social media, the role of technology, going back to the comparison to Rodney King and Genesis 6, for example. Genesis 6, what was really interesting about that is how a pager was used to mobilize protests and demonstrations. And then with Rodney King, you had the handheld camera that someone happened to have with them, able to video record it. And then, of course, with Black Lives Matter, the impact of social media to take a message, that message goes viral, and immediately you see the possibility and the power of mobilizing not just a community in your local space, your local cultural landscape, but a community around the world. So you see the power of this technology. With George Floyd, you have the young lady, 17-year-old, who had a cell phone, and she stood her ground and video recorded, almost 9 minutes of this event. And so the power of technology today is very, very different. And you can see there's a historical trajectory of how, as we get access to technology, we redefine our sense of citizenship. The technology helps us to assert our rights in citizenship and demands for democracy. And more importantly, or equally importantly, I think that this technology has really changed the way we see community and define community. You think about the civil rights marches in the 1960s, for example, they were very localized. You had the Selma March, Birmingham, March on Washington, Chicago. These marches were really named after the places where they took place. And that defined the community. Even as media covered, and that's a very different thing today, mobilizing a community isn't a matter of calling meetings at a house of worship or knocking on doors or passing out flyers on a corner. You send a tweet and immediately it's like flash mobilization. You've mobilized the community all the way around the world to protest against this injustice. And that's part of the reason why this moment and Black Lives Matter, and I would say George Floyd's death, are historical because they show us the power of technology and how technology has democratized how we define ourselves, our rights, and our communities.
What would you say is your proudest acquisition that you've been able to bring in?
Oh, gosh, I got so many. All of them for many different reasons. One of the things that I was very proud of, I wanted to make sure I built one of the best and most impressive photography collections of the Poor People's Campaign, and then shifting to, looking at gaps in the historical canon of civil rights photography. I'm sort of proud of that because we have a collection that represents a number of women, which is unusual. Women don't get recognized as they should as photographers, particularly during the civil rights movement. I wanted to really change people's minds about this moment in time.
Is there something that you are working toward in your acquisitions?
No, we just want to make sure that we can collect things to preserve them for generations to come. As long as there's an America, then there's the Smithsonian protecting, our history and preserving our history.
Well, the Museum of African American History and Culture was incredibly popular when it debuted, and somehow I have the feeling that after this whole coronavirus pandemic and lockdown is over, there are going to be even longer lines to come and see this story being told. So thank you very much for coming on the Art Angle, Aaron. This was a real pleasure.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of The Art Angle. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Tim Schneider and Caroline Goldstein and edited by Nick Long. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.